Hello everyone, Stjepan here, and welcome to the first video in the series on chess Middlegames. Today we are going to talk about key squares, how to identify them, how to spot the weaknesses in your own and in your opponent's position, how to identify a square as a potential outpost, and how to calculate your weight to utilizing that. Okay, so let's start. We are going to go over 4 positions as examples, because there's really no easier way to study such thematic ideas in a middle game as weak squares if you don't use a normal position from a normal game. So the first game, I would like to start from here, is Kasimdanov versus Megaranto from the 2008 Dresden Olympiad. Now, assessing the position. If you think about weak squares, during a game you can't really expect your mind in a way that it only assesses a position for its weak squares. That is something that you have to include in your critical thinking during a game at every move, because if you don't, then you are probably going to miss some key strategic ideas. So one thing that I would like to emphasize at start, together with trying to think of ways to remaneuver your pieces, trying to think of king safety, pawn structure, ways to win material, spotting tactical possibilities. One other key factor in every position is to look for weak squares, and this is what I believe differentiates weak and strong players the most. Weak players tend to think about material, and stronger players tend to think about squares much more, because even though placing a piece somewhere or trying to attack something might bring you an advantage, more often than not it happens that a clear advantage is created because you have identified a weak square and utilized it properly. Now this first position is a clear example of that. Now black has just moved his knight from to c7 from d5. One square that pops into your mind immediately, I hope, is the d6 square, and this is the square that we are going to discuss. Now, first of all, that might be considered the main weakness in the position. Let's go on. For black, the key weaknesses are the d6 square, the b6 square, but that isn't as useful. And for example, if the g7 pawn wasn't on the board, then f6 would also be a weakness. In white's position, the main weakness is the d5 square. Now, what is a weakness? There are several ways to identify a square as a weakness. The easiest way is to spot a square which can't be attacked or defended by a pawn, which is basically the same thing. So the d5 square and the d6 square are great examples of that. So the d6 square can't be contested by a black pawn in the same way that the d5 square can't be contested by a white pawn. So if black manages to get his piece into d5, the only way for white to contest that piece would be with another piece, so not with the pawn. And the same goes for the d6 outpost, potential outpost for white. If white manages to get a piece into d6, there would be no way for black to contest that piece apart from with his own piece. So the general idea after you have spotted a weakness is to try and imagine what you want to do with that weakness. Advantages in chess are plentiful, and advantages could be material advantages, static advantages, dynamic advantages, tactical possibilities, being a pawn up, whatever, having the bishop pair. And the weak square or an outpost is one of the biggest advantages you could get. Now, if you don't utilize it properly, it's completely pointless. If you have an extra pawn, it's an extra pawn. If your opponent's position has a potential weakness and you don't use it, then it's not a weakness at all. So now, what Kasimdanov must have been thinking, because his reasoning was correct and he continued in the best possible way, is how do I use the d6 weakness? Generally, the best piece to occupy a weak square with is a knight, because the knight has the most control over the most squares, and usually in closed positions where outposts arise, you want to have your knight on an outpost. If you imagined a bishop being here, it would be a great piece controlling 6 squares. If you imagine the knight being here, then the knight would be controlling b7, c8, e8, f7, f5, etc. So the knight would be an octopus knight, so to speak. So if you imagined a knight being on d6, that would be an almost winning positional advantage for white. So how do you occupy the d6 square? This is your second stage of your position assessment and trying to identify key squares. Now, first of all, you need to identify defenders of the square. So, which piece is defending the d6 square? It's clear that it's the e7 bishop. So if you manage to get rid of this strong bishop, then it's clear that the d6 square would be undefended. The only other way to defend it with an equally worthy piece would be with a knight. So if white manages to get his knight into d6, black probably wouldn't give up an exchange or a queen for that, so black would ideally want to trade it off for his bishop or one of his knights. For now, the bishop is the main defender. So what does white do? White's main idea is to exchange that bishop. In this position, there are several ways to approach this weakness. One idea is knight to e4, knight to d6. For now, that knight would simply be captured by the bishop. Another idea is knight to e4, trying to get your knight into d6, but before that, preparing having your other knight replace it. So, for example, knight to d2, knight to c4, and then the other knight controls d6 as well. So if you get one of your knights to c4, the other one to e4, then you would have two attackers on the d6 square, and once black exchanges one of the knights, the other knight replaces it. In this particular position, that would win an exchange, so this is a very serious threat. Here, Kasimdanov continued with knight to e4. Now, this move is twofold. Firstly, it controls d6 immediately and threatens to jump in. For example, if the bishop moves to d8, which would be a ridiculous move, but just for an example, then the knight would immediately come into d6 and perhaps not even capture the exchange, because you could argue that the knight on d6 is much stronger than any rook. But a second idea behind the move is to exchange the dark squared bishop. If you consider the free squares for the bishop, there are basically none. One of them is on d8 and that's it. So if white manages to play bishop to g5, then the black bishop would be forced to exchange itself for the white bishop. And as we said, once you remove the main defender of a square, then the square is unprotected. So if this piece weren't on the board, knight to d6 would be a serious threat. So the clear idea behind the move knight to e4, firstly was to control d6, and secondly to bring the second defender to the g5 square and play the move bishop to g5. Okay, here as a reaction, Megaranto played an excellent move, and that was the move h6. That simply prevents the bishop to g5. So that means that, of course, both players are grandmasters and strong players, so they both saw the threat. He reacted properly. Let's say he doesn't react properly. After knight to e4, let's say he plays b3. I'm sorry. After knight to e4, let's say he plays rook to b8. Let's say a pointless move. Now the immediate threat is utilized, bishop to g5, and there is no way for black to prevent the bishop trade. Bishop takes g5, knight takes g5, h6, chasing the knight away, knight to f3. And now the d6 square can no longer be contested. Let's say rook to d8, knight to d6. This is now a monster knight, and white's position is winning. So after knight to e4, h6 was a timely reaction and probably the only defense. And here you can see how a weak square can be a much greater danger than a tactical threat or an opportunity to win material. Getting his knight into d6 would be a winning advantage for white. The game continued after h6, with white struggling to utilize the square anyway. This was just one defense. White continues. Bishop to e3, g5, knight f to d2, going for the c4 square and trying to get his second knight looking at the d6 square, queen to g6, attacking the knight. So now if knight to c4, queen takes e4, f3 defending the knight, rook c to d8, knight to c4. Now you already have two attackers on the square, and black finds the only defense, knight to b5. Now, of course, black is struggling to prevent the knight coming there. In any position where white gets his piece, his pawn instead of a piece into d6, then the square isn't utilized. The square is basically taken up by a useless pawn, and black is going to win it. So under no circumstances white wants to get his pieces into d6 when they can be captured twice or thrice, and to have a position in which he ends up with a pawn on d6. So now the fight continues. Rook c to d1, king to h8, rook to d3, king to g8, just trying to maneuver their pieces. And now white builds up the pressure, etc., etc. White ended up winning this game, but the point of the square control was shown. So you basically have a battle of ideas around a single square. And to emphasize the importance of this square, from move 17, from move 18, after knight to e4, for the next 10 moves, these two players fought against one square. So the control of one square was key. Okay, let's move on to the second game. This game was Azarov Sochko from Ostrava 2009. Here, the position isn't as clear. If you try to assess the weaknesses, you could say that black has several potential weaknesses in his position. White doesn't really have that many potential weaknesses, but the key thing in this position is that white is very close to controlling the e6 square. If the f7 pawn wasn't there, then e6 would be a perfect outpost. In this position, after king to f8, white played queen to b4, and this now has a clear tactical threat. I wouldn't want to go into tactics too much, but white is now threatening simply to, let's say, black plays a useless move, rook to b8. White is now threatening to capture the knight, bishop takes e7, king takes e7, and now this pawn is hanging because this pawn is pinned. So let's say knight g5, bishop e5, knight e5. So a tactical threat which would give white a winning position. However, this threat is very hard to defend anyway. Black played knight to g8, trying to remove his knight from the sensitive square, but this now simply allows white to capture anyway. So knight g5, bishop takes e5, knight takes e5, f6. And this was the whole point of white's tactical idea. Okay, let's go back. After queen b4, knight g8, black was counting on the fact that this tactic cannot be played because of f6, because white ends up winning a pawn. However, what white had in mind from the start of this tactical sequence was the weak e6 square, and white assessed that in a position in which he is a piece down for 2 pawns and is able to get his knight into e6, his position would be superior, and that was proven magnificently. So knight g5, he went for the tactic anyway. Bishop takes e5, knight takes e5, f6, and now how does he reroute his knight into e6? He saw this position ahead before he went in for the piece sacrifice. He must have. So one way to get into e6 is knight f3, knight g5, knight e6, and it's in timely fashion, because if black doesn't capture this bishop, then he's just material down. So knight to f3, f takes g5, knight takes g5, and he's going to get into e6. This bishop is too far away to contest the knight. Okay, so now after h6, knight e6 check. And this is now such a superior knight that it more than compensates for black's weaknesses. Let's go back to the starting position. After queen to b4, queen to b4 was played with a clear intention to capture the pawn, but this whole thing wouldn't have worked if white hasn't assessed e6 as a terrible weakness in black's position. So this is one example of where a weakness isn't clear as in the previous position, but it's still so dangerous to allow a white knight to get into this square that it's an almost winning advantage. In this position, after knight e6 check, the engine, if I turned on the engine, this is +4 or more, so definitely winning advantage. Now, how to utilize this advantage is another thing, but this knight is so strong that it will create chances by itself, and white's position will naturally develop. Okay, another example which I wanted to show you is from a very famous game from the Fischer-Spassky 72 match in Reykjavik, Iceland. In this game, Spassky had the white pieces, Bobby Fischer had the black pieces, and this was round 13. I'm going to write down all the games in the description below so you can find them on chessgames.com or wherever. Okay, in this position, Spassky retreated his knight to d3, and he did it with a specific purpose, to get into the d6 square. Assessing the potential weaknesses. Okay, in white's position, a clear weakness, I wouldn't say exists, because there aren't any potential outposts. In black's position, a very real potential weakness is the d6 square. So if the c7 pawn moves at any point, then any white knight would be a monster piece on d6. And in this position, Bobby Fischer went for that anyway, because he saw a tactical opportunity which justified the weakening of the square. So this is something you have to be aware of as well. Now, Boris Spassky was a great chess player, and he was one of the best positional players of his age, and of course he understood weak squares and outposts, and he understood that if he got his knight into d6, that would be very strong. However, in this particular position, he oversaw a tactical thing. Okay, so Bobby Fischer here played c5, positively inviting after c5 the knight coming to b5. So you're going to see this tactic in a short while. But if after c5, knight to b5, white wasn't risking this tactical blow, then this position would be winning. So after queen to c6, knight to d6, this position is so strong for white, except for that one tactical thing. So this would be a key outpost for the white knight. However, in this position, Bobby Fischer played it for a specific reason. Queen takes d6, sacrificing the queen temporarily, e d6, bishop c3, b c3, and here black is better. Black is going to round up this pawn and have a better position. But let's go back. After knight to d3, Bobby Fischer, of course, was one of the strongest players of all time, if not the strongest. So this is a great example of how outpost planning works during a real game, and even if you're Boris Spassky, a very strong grandmaster. So Boris Spassky has very keen senses in chess, and he saw the weakness immediately. He saw that this knight is very strong, this knight is very strong. If the c-pawn doesn't move, then these knights are great in the center, controlling a lot of key squares. So he thought that Bobby Fischer might chase them away. So after c5, knight b5, queen c6, d6, he must have thought that this position was much better for him. However, the tactical sequence ended up losing the game for him. But I would like you to realize how important it is to plan the outposts. It's not always clear, as in the first position, which we saw here. It's not that clear in every position that you already have a ready-made outpost for your pieces. This position is much clearer. After knight to e4, you have a clear plan. You can already visualize your knight coming into d2, into c4, and controlling the square. You can visualize yourself exchanging this bishop. Here, in this position, it's not as clear, and you have to provoke your opponent into weakening the square even further. So potentially weak squares are just as important to spot as already weak squares, because very often during a game you're going to have to provoke your opponent into creating a weakness, and the easiest weaknesses to provoke are square weaknesses. It's much easier than to have your opponent weaken a pawn or weaken some other material. So weakening a square often comes easier for players than weakening material. So in this position, knight to d3 was a clear provocation, because the move c5 comes in naturally and this square becomes weak. It didn't work, but well. Okay, and the last position I would like to go over is another example of how choosing a weak square sort of misfired, and it didn't work, but it was still a very strong idea. After knight g4, by the way, this is Fischer Bisgeier from the 63-64 US Championship. You can find that game online as well, study it. Fischer ended up winning, but Bisgeier put up a lot of defense. So Bisgeier has the black pieces here. And here, he played a great positional idea. In this position, Bisgeier played the move c4. And what this move does is that it creates an immediate potential outpost for the black pieces. Any black piece coming into d3 would be a monster piece, ideally a knight, and black still has two knights on the board. According to the engines, the move c4 wasn't the best move, but from a human perspective, after you play c4, you have created such a crucial weakness in the position that white is going to have to consider it before any of his next moves. So white is going to have to keep the d3 weakness in mind throughout the game. And Bisgeier found a great tactical way to utilize the weakness as well. In this position, Bobby Fischer played the move queen to f3. And Bisgeier used the tempo. Now the pawn is attacked, so Bisgeier used this tempo, provoking the queen to f3. Bishop takes g4, queen takes g4, and here he played knight to e6. Knight to e6 is in its own right probably one of the best moves on the board. Now, it creates two threats. One of them is knight to c5, and you can see which square the knight on c5 is eyeing, so the knight is able to come into d3. And you can see that even though Bobby Fischer is on the white side of this game, Arthur Bisguier managed to, after this simple move c4, create a huge weakness in the position and utilize it almost instantaneously. So queen f3, bishop takes g4, queen takes g4, knight e6. Okay. Now the second key factor in this position, after creating the outpost, is to remove the potential defenders. Now, Bisguier would of course have wanted to exchange this bishop. It isn't possible at the moment, but the second thing he has to consider is the fact that white has an outpost of his own. So let's come back to the original position. Okay, here, okay. Knight to g4, c4. Before black has played c4, black has to make a decision. You can see that white is able to play knight to e3 and knight to d5. Now, in this current position, the knight coming to d5 would just be captured by the bishop. So black has ample defense for this particular square. On the other hand, white doesn't have that many defenders because black already has a rook eyeing the d3 square, and black can double up on the d3 square. So black has a greater potential of creating a permanent outpost. So in this position, Bisguier couldn't exchange this bishop, which would be ideal. So okay, let's not do that. Let's go for a weakness in white's position instead. Queen f3, bishop takes, queen takes, knight e6. Eyeing the c5 square, getting into d3. Now, after the move h5 played by Fischer, because Fischer does have a kingside initiative here, king to h8, king to g2, here g5 was played by Bisguier, which is a sort of dubious move, closing down the position, but it's not clear whether this is beneficial or not. It's creating a lot of weaknesses. Bishop to e3 by Fischer, and now this allowed for a great tactical blow by Bisguier. Now, firstly, another thing you should consider here is if the c3 pawn weren't here, let's say the c3 pawn was off the board, then d4 would be a huge hole and the perfect outpost. But as we said, d3 is already ripe for occupation. So in this position, Bisguier can either choose to put his knight on c5 and get into d3, or here he saw a tactical possibility and he played knight to f4 check. The same idea in mind, getting into d3. It doesn't really do much else. Now, capturing wouldn't be good because it would open the g file. Let's see, g takes f4, g takes f4, attacking the bishop, and if the bishop moves, white would lose the queen, so the knight can't really be captured. So after bishop to e3, knight to f4, the king has to move. Bobby Fischer moved his king to h2. Now, of course, the knight is on pre, and it can be captured, and now knight to d3. And there you have it. Bisguier utilized a weakness in his opponent's camp perfectly, and he got everything he wanted after a position. And it all started sort of calmly. After the move knight g4, the move c4. And 10 moves later, this outpost is utilized. And this is the beauty of thinking of squares. The move c4... in itself, okay, it does block down the queen side, it does restrain the light squared bishop, which is on c2, but the most important thing that this move does, it controls the d3 square, and it's really not easy to dampen that control. So let's see that again. Queen f3, bishop g4, queen g4, knight e6, h5. Here he found this tactical possibility, but it would have worked all the same with the move bishop to c5. Here, in this position, of course not, because the bishop on e3 would probably capture. And Bobby Fischer would be more than happy to exchange his bishop pair for this strong knight. But after the move bishop to e3, the second square worked, knight to f4, king h2, knight to d3. And in this position, Bobby Fischer had to make a choice. And this is what happens once you allow your opponent to utilize one of the key weaknesses in your position. You have to decide whether you want to keep this strong piece here. It's already looking at b2, and it's the strongest minor piece on the board by far. If you compare it to this bishop, it's ridiculously stronger. So you have to either decide whether you want to keep the knight there or whether you want to allow black to create a passed pawn. Bobby Fischer made an easy decision, taking cd3, and this is now a very strong pawn. Now, I'm not going to get into the particular details in this exact position because it doesn't matter. Bobby Fischer went on to win, and this position is still better for white. But you can see how black managed to trade a strong square for a strong passed pawn. And this is what you usually get if you utilize a square properly. After c4, if you think that Bisgar played c4 with a clear idea of creating a passed pawn on d3, that's remarkable. And that's the way you need to consider a position. So assess the weaknesses in your position, assess the weaknesses in your opponent's position, think of potential outposts, imagine potential outposts, and imagine your pieces coming to the outposts. This knight made a remarkable journey, knight to e6, knight to f4, knight to d3. So try to imagine, try to visualize paths for your pieces getting into outposts, and then calculate what do you get with that. If white captures, what do I get? If white doesn't capture, do I have anything? Okay, once again, the games are listed in the description below. I hope you liked the examples. I hope you got something from this first middle game strategic chess series video, and let me know what you think. Thanks very much for watching, and stay tuned for more chess. Bye bye. See you later.